23 bodies lay buried beneath the tobacco fields of Henrico County, Virginia, their graves unmarked and their disappearances carefully orchestrated by two brothers who turned murder into profit. What began as a seemingly innocent wager between siblings on a humid September night in 1851 would expose a killing enterprise that had operated undetected for over a decade, claiming victims from 3 states and generating enough blood money to build one of the largest tobacco plantations in the Commonwealth. The local sheriff's records, sealed for nearly 70 years, reveal that Margaret Carmichael was not the first wife to vanish from the estate, nor would she be the last to discover the terrible truth about her husband's family business. Court documents from Richmond detail how the brothers had perfected their system of luring wealthy travelers to their deaths, operating with such precision that not a single disappearance had been connected to Riverside Manor until Margaret's investigation brought their reign of terror to its bloody conclusion. Before we continue with the story of the Carmichael plantation and the deadly secrets buried in its soil, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers across America. The autumn of 1851 brought an unusual chill to central Virginia, setting the stage for events that would forever stain the reputation of one of the region's most prominent tobacco-growing families and expose a pattern of calculated murder that had gone undetected for more than 12 years. Henrico County stretched across rolling hills dotted with plantation houses, their white columns gleaming against fields of golden tobacco leaves ready for harvest. The region had prospered during the tobacco boom of the 1840s, with wealthy planters building grand estates along the James River and establishing trade routes that connected Virginia's agricultural heart to markets in Richmond, Petersburg, and beyond. The economy depended on a complex network of traveling merchants, tobacco buyers, and financial agents who moved regularly between plantations, carrying substantial sums of cash and conducting business far from the oversight of urban authorities. The Carmichael estate, known locally as Riverside Manor, commanded nearly 2,000 acres along the James River, making it one of the largest tobacco operations between Richmond and Petersburg. The manor house itself stood 3 stories tall, built from local brick and Virginia pine, with wraparound porches that caught the river breeze during the sweltering summer months. Massive oak trees, some over a century old, provided shade for the circular driveway, where carriages regularly arrived carrying visitors from across the Commonwealth. The house featured 12 rooms, including a library lined with leather-bound volumes, a formal dining room capable of seating 16 guests, and 6 bedrooms decorated with furniture imported from Philadelphia and Baltimore. The plantation's location proved strategically perfect for the brothers' purposes. Situated along the main thoroughfare connecting Richmond to Petersburg, it naturally attracted travelers seeking overnight accommodation. The James River provided transportation for tobacco shipments, while also offering convenient disposal options for anything the brothers preferred to keep hidden from curious neighbors. Dense woods bordered 3 sides of the property, ensuring privacy for activities that required discretion. Brothers Edmund and Clayton Carmichael had inherited the estate from their father in 1839, along with 47 enslaved workers and debts that threatened to destroy everything their family had built over 3 generations. Old Josiah Carmichael had been a respected member of Virginia society, serving 2 terms in the state legislature and maintaining friendships with prominent political figures throughout the Commonwealth. His sudden death from apoplexy in the spring of 1839 left his sons with a plantation that appeared prosperous but was actually hemorrhaging money due to poor crop prices and accumulated gambling debts. Edmund, the elder by 2 years, possessed the calculating mind of a businessman with dark hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of potential profit. Standing just over 6 feet tall, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a military officer, though he had never served in any capacity beyond the local militia. His education at the College of William and Mary had provided him with the social connections and financial knowledge that would prove essential to the brothers' future enterprises. Edmund's correspondence with Richmond bankers and Petersburg merchants revealed a man capable of extraordinary charm when circumstances required it, but also possessed of a coldness that unnerved even his closest business associates. Clayton carried himself with the easy charm that made him popular among the county's social circles, particularly with the daughters of neighboring planters who found his quick wit and handsome features irresistible. 2 years younger than Edmund, Clayton stood slightly shorter, but with broader shoulders and the kind of infectious smile that could disarm suspicion and open doors throughout Virginia society. His reputation as a skilled horseman and enthusiastic participant in fox hunts had earned him invitations to the finest homes in central Virginia, providing valuable intelligence about wealthy travelers and their planned routes. Together, they had transformed a failing plantation into one of Virginia's most profitable tobacco enterprises, though few neighbors understood exactly how the brothers had managed such a remarkable turnaround. The transformation had begun in 1840, when the brothers started offering hospitality to travelers who appeared to possess substantial financial resources. What had initially seemed like traditional Southern hospitality gradually evolved into something far more sinister as the brothers discovered how easy it was to make wealthy strangers disappear without attracting unwanted attention from local authorities. The county seat of Richmond lay 30 miles to the east, close enough for regular commerce, but far enough to ensure privacy for the brothers' more delicate business matters. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, a political appointee more interested in maintaining social harmony than investigating suspicious deaths, had proven remarkably accommodating when the brothers occasionally needed official documentation to support their explanations for various disappearances. The sheriff's willingness to accept their stories without extensive investigation had been purchased through a combination of financial contributions to his political campaigns and regular invitations to the elaborate dinner parties that made Riverside Manor a center of Henrico County's social life. Henrico County in 1851 was experiencing the tensions that would soon tear the nation apart. Debates over slavery's expansion, economic pressures from northern industrial growth, and whispered conversations about states' rights that grew louder with each passing month. These political distractions provided perfect cover for the brothers' activities, as local authorities focused their attention on larger regional concerns rather than investigating isolated disappearances that could easily be attributed to the dangers of frontier travel. Margaret Dunmore had arrived at Riverside Manor in June of 1851 as Edmund's bride, having met him during a spring social in Richmond hosted by the Virginia Agricultural Society. The daughter of a declining tobacco family from Chesterfield County, she brought little dowry, but possessed the kind of refined beauty and social connections that could open doors for ambitious men. Her auburn hair and green eyes had caught Edmund's attention immediately, but it was her quick wit and ability to navigate complex social situations that convinced him she would be the perfect wife for a man with secrets to protect. Margaret's education had been more extensive than typical for women of her social class, thanks to a progressive aunt who had insisted on hiring private tutors to supplement her formal schooling. She spoke fluent French, had studied botany and natural history, and possessed a keen understanding of financial matters that her father had encouraged, despite social conventions that discouraged such knowledge in women. These skills, intended to make her an accomplished hostess and conversation partner, would ultimately prove essential to her survival and eventual triumph over the Carmichael brothers. The wedding had been a grand affair, attended by politicians from Richmond and plantation owners from across central Virginia. Governor John Floyd himself had offered a toast to the happy couple, while Richmond's most prominent merchants and bankers celebrated what they believed would be a union that strengthened Virginia's agricultural aristocracy. Margaret had seemed genuinely happy during those first months of marriage, writing letters to her sister in Petersburg about the grandeur of her new home and the kindness of her brother-in-law Clayton, who had welcomed her into the family with enthusiasm that some neighbors found almost excessive. The letters, later discovered among Margaret's personal effects, revealed her initial impressions of Riverside Manor as a palace compared to our poor farm in Chesterfield, and described elaborate dinner parties where the finest gentlemen in Virginia gathered to discuss politics and business while consuming the most exquisite wines and delicacies. She had been particularly impressed by the brothers' apparent wealth, noting that they seemed to possess resources far beyond what tobacco farming typically provided, even for the most successful planters. But by September, those closest to Margaret began to notice changes in her demeanor that suggested all was not well at Riverside Manor. She appeared distracted during social calls, often staring out windows toward the tobacco fields with an expression that her friend Sarah Caldwell would later describe to authorities as deeply troubled, as if she had seen something that haunted her waking hours. Her appetite diminished noticeably, and she began declining invitations to the social gatherings that had once delighted her, citing headaches and fatigue that seemed to have no medical explanation. The enslaved workers at Riverside Manor spoke in hushed tones about their mistress, noting how she had begun taking long walks around the property, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time. Old Moses, who tended the kitchen garden and had served the Carmichael family for over 20 years, would later tell investigators that he had seen Margaret digging near the old tobacco barn on multiple occasions, always alone and always looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being discovered. The workers had also noticed her asking unusual questions about the plantation's history, particularly about previous mistresses and guests who had visited in years past. The evening of September 18, 1851, began like many others at Riverside Manor, with the three family members gathering for dinner in the grand dining room beneath a crystal chandelier imported from France during the plantation's more prosperous days. The table was set with the finest china and silver, reflecting the brothers' insistence on maintaining appearances even when conducting their darkest business. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows across portraits of long-dead Carmichael ancestors who gazed down with expressions that seemed to disapprove of their descendants' activities. The meal proceeded normally through the first 3 courses, with conversation focusing on tobacco prices and political developments in Richmond. Clayton regaled them with gossip from his recent trip to Petersburg, while Edmund discussed his plans for expanding the plantation's operations in the coming year. Margaret participated in the conversation with her usual grace, though careful observers might have noticed a tension in her voice that suggested underlying anxiety about something more serious than social pleasantries. The atmosphere changed dramatically when Clayton, emboldened by several glasses of bourbon and apparently seeking to provoke some reaction from his increasingly distant sister-in-law, proposed what he called a gentleman's wager to his brother. The words hung in the air like smoke from the candles as Margaret set down her fork and stared at Clayton with growing alarm. "I wager," Clayton said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, "that I can seduce your lovely wife within a fortnight, and she'll be begging me to take her away from this dreary plantation life." He raised his glass toward Margaret with a mock toast that sent bourbon sloshing over the rim. "No offense intended, my dear sister-in-law, but Edmund has always been rather predictable in matters of the heart. Perhaps a woman of your obvious intelligence and beauty requires more exciting companionship than my dear brother can provide." The casual cruelty of the proposal struck Margaret like a physical blow, but what disturbed her even more was Edmund's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. Instead of the explosive anger she expected from any decent husband, Edmund leaned back in his chair, studying his brother with the same calculating expression she had seen him use when negotiating tobacco prices with buyers from Richmond. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made his features appear almost predatory as he considered the proposal with apparent seriousness. "And what stakes do you propose, brother?" Edmund asked, his voice unnaturally calm for a man whose wife had just been propositioned at his own dinner table. "What would make such a wager worth the risk of family harmony and social reputation? Surely you understand that such games require substantial motivation to justify the potential consequences." Clayton's grin widened, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use and excessive wine consumption. His eyes gleamed with the anticipation of a man who believed victory was already within his grasp. $500 says I can have her in my bed before October arrives. And if I succeed, you write off that debt I owe you from the Richmond land deal. Another 1,000, if memory serves. But here's the truly interesting part, dear brother. If she proves more resistant than anticipated, we'll know she's discovered something about our family business that requires immediate attention. The words hit Margaret like ice water as she suddenly understood that this was not merely a crude wager between brothers, but something far more sinister. The casual reference to family business and the meaningful look that passed between Edmund and Clayton suggested depths of conspiracy that she was only beginning to comprehend. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, fighting to maintain composure while her mind raced through the implications of what she had just heard. Edmund's continued calm as he considered the proposal filled Margaret with a terror that went beyond simple humiliation. The man she had married, who had courted her with poetry and promises of a peaceful life among Virginia's rural aristocracy, was revealing himself to be something entirely different. A calculating predator who viewed his own wife as little more than a test subject in some larger, more sinister scheme. "Make it 1,000, Edmund said finally, extending his hand toward his brother with the same business-like manner he might use to conclude any commercial transaction. "But if you fail, you transfer your share of the North Tobacco fields to my name alone. And Clayton, if she proves problematic in ways that require permanent solutions, we'll split the costs of resolving the situation according to our usual arrangements." The brothers shook hands across the dinner table while Margaret stared at them in horror, their bourbon glasses clinking together like a death knell. Neither man looked at her directly, as if her feelings on the matter were entirely irrelevant to their agreement. The casual way they discussed her potential murder, for that was clearly what Edmund meant by permanent solutions, revealed a level of callousness that suggested this was not their first such conversation. That night, Margaret lay awake in the four-poster bed she shared with Edmund, listening to him breathe beside her and trying to understand what had just happened. The man she had married seemed like a stranger, capable of wagering away her honor as casually as he might bet on a horse race, and apparently willing to countenance her murder if she became inconvenient. The realization that both brothers viewed her as an object to be won, lost or disposed of, filled her with a cold fury that would only grow stronger in the days to come. Sleep eluded her as she replayed every conversation, every strange incident, every unexplained absence that had puzzled her during her months at Riverside Manor. The locked rooms that Edmund claimed contained nothing but old furniture, the workers who disappeared without explanation, the guests who arrived with fanfare but seemed to vanish without proper farewells. All of these mysteries took on new and terrifying significance in light of what she had just witnessed. Over the next week, Clayton began his campaign of seduction with the subtlety of a man who had never been refused anything he truly wanted. He appeared at Margaret's side during her morning walks, offering his arm and engaging her in conversations about literature and music that revealed a surprisingly cultured mind beneath his rakish exterior. His knowledge of poetry and philosophy suggested an education that matched her own, while his observations about art and architecture demonstrated travels that extended far beyond Virginia's borders. He brought her small gifts that seemed carefully chosen to appeal to her specific interests. A book of botanical illustrations from Richmond, wildflowers picked from the riverbank and arranged with obvious skill, a silk ribbon that perfectly matched her eyes. Each gesture was accompanied by compliments that grew increasingly bold and personal, delivered with the kind of practiced charm that suggested extensive experience in seducing women despite their initial resistance. But Margaret was not the naive young woman the brothers believed her to be. Her education and natural intelligence, combined with the growing certainty that her life was in danger, sharpened her powers of observation to an extraordinary degree. She began to pay closer attention to the strange rhythms of life at Riverside Manor, noting how certain rooms remained locked, even when the brothers claimed to be conducting routine business. How conversations between Edmund and Clayton ceased abruptly whenever she approached, and how workers sometimes disappeared from the fields without the usual explanations about illness or family emergencies that typically accompanied such absences. Her walks around the property took on new purpose as she searched for answers to questions that grew more disturbing with each passing day. The vast acreage of Riverside Manor provided numerous opportunities for concealment, and Margaret began to suspect that the brothers were hiding far more than extramarital affairs or financial irregularities. The very landscape seemed to hold secrets, from the dense woods that bordered the property to the seemingly innocent outbuildings scattered across the plantation grounds. The first concrete evidence of the brothers' true nature came to Margaret on a rain-soaked afternoon in late September, when she discovered a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a loose brick in the library fireplace. She had been examining the room's architecture, searching for possible hiding places where important documents might be concealed, when her fingers found the brick that shifted slightly under pressure. Behind it lay a cavity that contained not only the ledger, but also a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to people who were no longer at Riverside Manor. The book contained entries dating back to 1840, written in Edmund's precise handwriting, documenting what appeared to be a series of business transactions unlike anything she had ever seen. Each entry followed the same meticulous format: a name, a date, a location, a physical description, and a sum of money. Thomas Whitaker, September 12, 1842, Richmond Road, tall brown hair, gold watch, $200. Samuel Chen, March 3, 1843, Petersburg Pike, short black hair, Chinese features, silk merchant, $150. Father Miguel Santos, July 19, 1844, Church Creek, medium height, Hispanic, priest traveling north, $300. The list went on for page after page, containing over 60 names and representing thousands of dollars in mysterious income that far exceeded what any tobacco plantation could generate through legitimate farming operations. Each entry included details that suggested intimate knowledge of the victims, their physical appearance, their possessions, their reasons for traveling, and their estimated wealth. The level of detail implied systematic observation and planning that went far beyond random criminal opportunism. At first, Margaret wondered if the ledger documented some legitimate business dealing, perhaps debt collection, land speculation, or even slave trading, which, while morally reprehensible, would at least explain the secretive nature of the records. But as she studied the entries more carefully, disturbing patterns began to emerge that pointed toward something far more sinister than any conventional business enterprise. Many of the names were followed by notations in a different hand, which she recognized as Clayton's sprawling script that contrasted sharply with Edmund's precise penmanship. These notes contained phrases that chilled her blood: disposed of according to plan, no complications, or no further inquiries expected from family, or most chilling of all, Richmond authorities satisfied with explanation, case closed without investigation. The final section of the ledger contained what appeared to be a detailed map of the plantation grounds, drawn with the precision of a military engineer, and showing not only the obvious features like the manor house, tobacco fields, and river access, but also numerous small X marks scattered across areas that appeared to be unused woodland and fallow fields. 23 marks in total, each accompanied by initials and dates that corresponded exactly to entries in the main ledger. Margaret counted the marks twice, her hands trembling as the horrible truth began to crystallize in her mind. This was not a record of business transactions. It was a murder log, documenting more than a decade of systematic killing that had transformed Riverside Manor into a charnel house disguised as a respectable plantation. The X marks represented graves, and the carefully recorded sums represented the blood money stolen from victims who had made the fatal mistake of accepting the Carmichael brothers' hospitality. The personal items hidden with the ledger provided additional evidence of the brothers' crimes. A woman's wedding ring engraved with initials that did not match any current residents of the plantation, a gold pocket watch bearing the name of a Philadelphia merchant, a silver crucifix that had obviously belonged to a Catholic priest, and a collection of coins from various states that suggested victims had come from across the region to meet their deaths at Riverside Manor. Her investigation took on new urgency as she began to piece together the brothers' method with the thoroughness of a trained detective. The Carmichael plantation sat along a major thoroughfare between Richmond and Petersburg, making it a natural stopping point for travelers who needed overnight accommodation or simply wished to rest their horses during long journeys. The brothers had transformed their home into an elaborate trap, offering hospitality to well-dressed strangers carrying substantial amounts of cash, then murdering them for their money and belongings before disposing of the bodies in unmarked graves scattered across their vast property. The victims were chosen with careful attention to risk management, people traveling alone, without local connections, whose disappearances would not immediately attract attention from law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin across Virginia's rural counties. Merchants conducting business between cities, wealthy planters traveling to markets or social events, clergymen moving between parishes, and immigrants carrying their life savings in search of new opportunities, all made perfect targets for the brothers' enterprise. Margaret's walks around the property now focused on the areas marked in the ledger's map, and what she discovered there confirmed her worst fears about the true nature of Riverside Manor. Near the old tobacco barn, she found patches of ground where the earth seemed softer than the surrounding soil, as if it had been disturbed and replanted within recent years. The vegetation in these areas grew differently as well, with an unusual lushness that suggested fertilization by decomposing organic matter. By the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property, she discovered fragments of clothing and personal effects that had been carelessly buried or washed up during spring floods that periodically changed the creek's course. A brass button here, a piece of torn fabric there, a broken chain that had once held a pocket watch. Small remnants of lives that had been snuffed out for profit and convenience. The most disturbing discovery came when she found what appeared to be a partially collapsed root cellar hidden among the trees near the property's northern boundary. The structure had obviously been modified from its original purpose as food storage, with new drainage that led toward the creek and evidence of recent use that included tools for digging and chemicals that could accelerate decomposition. The smell that emanated from the cellar on warm days confirmed Margaret's suspicions about its current function in the brothers' operation. The realization that she was living among killers filled Margaret with a terror that she struggled to hide from her husband and brother-in-law during their daily interactions. But alongside the fear came a burning desire for justice and a growing understanding that she herself was in mortal danger. The wager between the brothers was not the innocent game of seduction she had initially believed. It was a test to determine whether she had discovered their secret and how best to silence her permanently. As October approached, Clayton's attempts at seduction became more aggressive and desperate, suggesting that he was under pressure to produce results within the time frame established by their wager. He cornered her in empty rooms with increasing frequency, pressing his attentions with a boldness that bordered on assault. But Margaret now understood that his interest in her was not romantic. He was trying to gauge how much she knew about the family business and whether she posed a threat that required elimination. Every conversation became a delicate dance of deception, as she tried to appear naive and unsuspecting while secretly gathering more evidence of the brothers' crimes. She learned to school her expressions and control her reactions, even when Clayton made comments that revealed his knowledge of events that should have been unknown to anyone except the victims and their killers. The breaking point came on the evening of September 30th, when Margaret overheard a conversation between Edmund and Clayton in the library that removed any remaining doubt about the brothers' intentions toward both herself and their next victim. Hidden behind the partially open door, she listened as they discussed their plans with the casual efficiency of men who had repeated this process dozens of times over the course of more than a decade. The tobacco buyer from North Carolina sent word that he'll arrive next week with the full payment. Edmund said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a businessman discussing a profitable transaction. William Henley is his name, apparently quite successful in the Piedmont region. His letter indicates he'll be traveling with at least $3,000 in cash, possibly more if he's planning to make additional purchases on his return journey. Clayton's laugh held genuine amusement as he contemplated their next victim. 3,000 would be our largest single take this year. More than enough to finance the expansion of the North Fields and still leave us with substantial reserves for winter expenses. Has he confirmed his arrival date? October 7th, Edmund replied. He plans to inspect the tobacco on the 8th and complete the transaction the following day. That gives us 3 days to plan the details, though our usual approach should suffice for a lone traveler carrying that amount of cash. I've already confirmed with Sheriff Garrett that he'll be visiting family in Richmond that week, so we won't need to worry about unexpected official visits during the crucial period. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, fighting back nausea as she listened to the brothers plan another murder with the same attention to detail they might bring to planning a dinner party. The casual reference to Sheriff Garrett's convenient absence confirmed her suspicions that local law enforcement was either complicit in the brothers' crimes or deliberately avoiding situations that might require them to investigate too closely. This one should bring us enough to expand the North Fields substantially, Edmund continued. Clayton, you'll handle the usual arrangements after dinner on the 8th? I assume we can count on your expertise with the nightcap preparation. We can't afford any mistakes with such a valuable guest. Of course, Clayton replied with the confidence of long practice. Though we should consider Margaret's situation soon. She's been asking too many questions about the locked rooms, and I noticed her near the old burial sites yesterday afternoon. Moses mentioned that she's been digging around the tobacco barn, apparently looking for something specific. The seduction approach isn't working as effectively as we anticipated. She's more intelligent than most women, and her education makes her naturally curious about things that don't concern her. Edmund's laugh held no warmth as he contemplated his wife's fate with the same cold calculation he applied to all his business decisions. Then we'll have to accelerate our timeline concerning dear Margaret. After we deal with the tobacco buyer, we'll arrange a suitable accident for our troublesome wife. Perhaps a fall from her horse during one of her beloved walks, or a tragic drowning in the river during an evening stroll. Accidents happen so frequently to curious wives who involve themselves in matters beyond their understanding. The brothers discussed various methods for eliminating Margaret with the same professional detachment they brought to planning their other murders, evaluating the relative merits of different approaches based on factors like credibility, timing, and the likelihood of attracting unwanted attention from Margaret's family in Chesterfield County. They had clearly given considerable thought to the problem she represented, and had reached the conclusion that her death was not only inevitable, but necessary for the continued success of their operation. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, fighting back the urge to vomit as she listened to the brothers plan her murder with the same casual efficiency they brought to their other victims. She had hoped against hope that Edmund retained some genuine affection for her. But now, she understood that she was simply another obstacle to be removed when convenient. The man who had courted her with poetry and promises of happiness had never existed. He was simply a mask worn by a calculating killer who viewed human life as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited for profit. The conversation continued with discussion of practical details that revealed the brothers' extensive experience in making people disappear without attracting unwanted attention. They had clearly refined their methods over the years, learning from mistakes and developing procedures that minimized risk while maximizing profit. Their success had made them confident to the point of arrogance, apparently believing that their wealth and social connections made them untouchable by local authorities who depended on their political support and financial contributions. But as Margaret listened to them plan her death, she realized that their confidence might also be their weakness. The brothers had grown so accustomed to success that they had become careless in certain ways, assuming that their victims would remain passive and accepting their fate without resistance. They had not anticipated that Margaret's education and intelligence would enable her to uncover their secrets, nor had they considered the possibility that a woman might be capable of fighting back with methods as ruthless as their own. That night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything and set in motion events that would bring the brothers' reign of terror to a bloody conclusion. She could not flee. Edmund controlled all their finances, and a woman traveling alone in 1851 would attract exactly the kind of attention she needed to avoid, while also being vulnerable to the same predators who had claimed so many other victims. She could not seek help from local authorities. The brothers' wealth and political connections in Henrico County ran too deep for her accusations to be believed without substantial proof, and Sheriff Garrett's complicity meant that approaching law enforcement would likely result in her immediate elimination. Her only option was to turn the brothers' own methods against them, using their confidence and assumptions about feminine helplessness to catch them off guard. If she was going to die at Riverside Manor, she would not go quietly, and she would ensure that justice was served, even if she did not survive to see it. Margaret began her preparation by studying the local flora during her walks with the systematic approach of a natural scientist, focusing on plants that grew wild around the plantation and could serve her deadly purpose. Her education had included extensive botany, knowledge that she now applied toward understanding which native species contained toxins powerful enough to kill grown men. Virginia's woods and fields contained several species of highly toxic plants, including water hemlock, which grew abundantly near the creek, deadly nightshade, which flourished in the shaded areas beneath the old oak trees, and pokeweed, whose roots contained concentrated poisons that could be extracted through careful preparation. Water hemlock, she learned from her botanical texts, was considered one of the most poisonous plants in North America, containing secutoxin that attacked the nervous system and caused death through respiratory failure. The plant's roots contained the highest concentration of poison, and the toxin could be extracted through a process of grinding and boiling that would create a colorless, nearly odorless liquid that could be easily added to food or drink without detection. She also began to document everything she had learned about the brothers' crimes, writing detailed accounts in a journal that she hid beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Her writings described the exact location of each burial site, marked on Edmund's map, copied entries from the murder ledger with precise attention to dates and victim descriptions, and detailed the patterns she had observed in the brothers' victim selection and disposal methods. The journal also contained her own observations about the brothers' personalities and habits, information that could prove valuable to any future investigation. Edmund's methodical nature and obsession with record-keeping, Clayton's impulsiveness and tendency toward overconfidence, their established routines and the security measures they employed to protect their secrets, all of these details were carefully recorded in case Margaret did not survive to testify about what she had discovered. If something happened to her, she wanted evidence to remain that might eventually bring the brothers to justice and provide closure for the families of their victims. Her writings included recommendations for where investigators should search for additional evidence, which local officials might be complicit in covering up the brothers' crimes, and how the murder enterprise had evolved over the years to become more sophisticated and profitable. Meanwhile, Clayton's frustration with his failing seduction grew more apparent each day, creating an atmosphere of increasing tension that made Margaret's position even more precarious. The October deadline for their wager was approaching rapidly, and Margaret's continued resistance was costing him both money and pride, while also raising questions about whether she might have discovered something that made her immune to his usual charm offensive. His attempts to corner her alone became more frequent and aggressive, requiring increasingly creative evasion on Margaret's part. She learned to vary her routines and never venture into isolated areas of the house or grounds without ensuring that enslaved workers or other witnesses were nearby. Clayton's behavior during these encounters revealed a man whose patience was rapidly approaching its breaking point, suggesting that the brothers might decide to abandon their original timeline and move against her sooner than planned. The arrival of Dr. William Henley from North Carolina provided Margaret with the opportunity she needed to implement her plan, while also potentially saving an innocent life. Henley arrived at Riverside Manor on October 7, 1851, driving a fine carriage pulled by matching bay horses and carrying himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to substantial wealth and social respect. He was exactly the type of victim the brothers preferred. Traveling alone, carrying a large sum of cash for his tobacco purchase, and with no local connections to immediately notice his disappearance if he failed to return home as scheduled. Margaret watched the familiar ritual unfold as the brothers welcomed their guest with exaggerated hospitality that masked their predatory intentions. They showed Dr. Henley to the finest guest room, served him their best bourbon imported from Kentucky, and engaged him in lengthy conversations about tobacco prices, market conditions, and political developments that might affect agricultural commerce. The doctor seemed genuinely pleased with his hosts and their hospitality, having no idea that he was being evaluated for murder rather than conducting legitimate business negotiations. Dr. Henley proved to be an educated and cultured man, with interests that extended far beyond tobacco farming and commercial transactions. His conversation revealed extensive travels throughout the South and considerable knowledge of literature, art, and natural history that made him an engaging dinner companion. Under different circumstances, Margaret thought she might have genuinely enjoyed his company and learned much from his experiences in other parts of the country. But the brothers' behavior during dinner confirmed that they had already decided on Dr. Henley's fate and were simply following their established routine for managing victims in the final hours before their elimination. Edmund's questions about the doctor's travel schedule and family connections were designed to confirm that his disappearance would not attract immediate attention, while Clayton's seemingly casual inquiries about his financial resources were intended to verify that the murder would generate sufficient profit to justify the risk. On the evening of October 8th, the brothers planned to implement their usual method, a carefully drugged nightcap that would render their victim unconscious, followed by suffocation that would simulate natural death from heart failure. The body would then be buried in one of the marked locations on their plantation map, while the victim's money and belongings were hidden until they could be safely converted to the brothers' use without attracting unwanted attention. But Margaret had spent the day preparing her own deadly surprise, using knowledge gained from her botanical studies to create a weapon that could eliminate all three men and end the brothers' murder enterprise permanently. She had extracted concentrated poison from water hemlock roots using a process she had learned from her natural history texts, creating a colorless, nearly odorless liquid that she carefully added to the bottle of bourbon Edmund planned to serve after dinner. The dose was calculated to be lethal for all three men based on their approximate body weights and the amount of alcohol they typically consumed during their evening gatherings. She could not risk leaving either brother alive to continue their killing spree or to seek revenge against her, and she felt no guilt about ensuring that Dr. Henley would also perish. His death would be attributed to the same poisoning that claimed the brothers, making him appear to be an unfortunate victim rather than raising questions about her own involvement in the events. The preparation had required careful timing and absolute secrecy, as she needed to ensure that the poison was added to the bourbon after the brothers had selected the bottle for serving, but before they actually consumed it. She had observed their routines carefully over the previous weeks, learning that Edmund always chose the bourbon personally and typically opened the bottle in the library while his guests were settling in for their final drinks of the evening. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Henrico County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this deadly game of deception and murder. The dinner proceeded normally through all 7 courses, with Dr. Henley praising the quality of the meal and expressing enthusiasm for completing their tobacco transaction the following morning. Edmund and Clayton played their parts perfectly, appearing as gracious hosts while secretly anticipating their victim's demise. Margaret sat quietly through the meal, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, knowing that within hours she would either be free from the brothers' threats or dead by their hands. As the evening progressed toward its deadly conclusion, Margaret excused herself from the dining room, claiming a headache that required rest and medication. This was part of her carefully orchestrated plan. She needed to be absent when the poison took effect, both to avoid suspicion and to ensure her own survival. From her bedroom window, she watched the three men move to the library for their final drinks, unaware that death was already waiting for them in the bottle of Kentucky bourbon that Edmund had selected for the occasion. The poison Margaret had prepared worked more slowly than she had anticipated, allowing for a terrifying period of uncertainty as she waited in her bedroom for sounds from the library below that would confirm the success of her plan. Water hemlock, she had learned from her botanical research, caused a gradual onset of symptoms. First nausea and stomach pain, then muscle spasms and convulsions, followed by respiratory failure and death. The process could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the dose and the victim's constitution, body weight, and the amount of alcohol consumed with the toxin. Margaret sat by her bedroom window, watching the library windows for signs of distress, while listening for any sounds that might indicate her plan was working. The autumn night was unusually quiet, with only the distant sound of the James River and the occasional call of a night bird to break the silence that seemed to press against the house like a living thing. As the clock in the hallway chimed 11, Margaret heard the first signs that her plan was beginning to work. Raised voices from the library, followed by the sound of a chair being overturned and glass breaking. Dr. Henley's voice could be heard, asking if anyone else felt unwell, his tone shifting from mild concern to genuine alarm, as the brothers began experiencing symptoms that clearly indicated something was seriously wrong. "Gentlemen, I feel most peculiar," she heard the doctor say, his voice carrying through the house's high ceilings and thin walls. "Perhaps something we ate has disagreed with us all. My stomach is cramping terribly, and I'm experiencing the most unusual sensations in my extremities." Edmund's voice, usually so controlled and measured, rose to a shout as he apparently realized what was happening to them. "The bourbon," he gasped, his words becoming increasingly slurred as the poison affected his nervous system. "Someone has poisoned the bourbon." The sound of breaking glass followed, presumably as one of the men knocked over a lamp or decorative item in his distress. Clayton's voice joined the chorus of alarm, but with a different quality that suggested he had consumed less of the poisoned bourbon and retained enough clarity to understand the implications of their situation. "Margaret," he called out, his voice echoing through the house with murderous rage. "Margaret, you poisonous witch! I know what you've done. You think you're clever, but you'll pay for this with your life." But Margaret's carefully calculated plan began to unravel when she heard Clayton's voice calling her name from downstairs with increasing urgency and violence. Unlike his brother and their guest, Clayton had apparently consumed less of the poisoned bourbon due to his habit of nursing his drinks while engaged in conversation, and he retained enough strength and coordination to move around despite the toxin's effects on his system. His calls grew more threatening and desperate as he realized the source of their collective illness and began to understand that his sister-in-law was not the helpless victim they had believed her to be. "Margaret," Clayton shouted again, his voice cracking with pain and rage. "You murdering bitch! I know what you've done, and I'm going to make you pay before this poison finishes its work. I'm dirty." The sound of his unsteady footsteps could be heard moving through the ground floor, searching for her with the determination of a dying man who wanted revenge before the toxin could complete its deadly work. Each stumble and crash as he knocked into furniture marked his progress toward the main staircase, and Margaret realized with growing terror that she had miscalculated either the dosage or the timing of the poison's effects. Clayton was still mobile and clearly intended to exact revenge before the water hemlock could finish its work on his nervous system. She grabbed the fireplace poker from beside her bedroom hearth, the only weapon available to defend herself against a dying man with nothing left to lose and the strength that comes from desperate fury. The sound of Clayton's labored breathing grew closer as he climbed the stairs, each step accompanied by a groan of pain as the poison continued its relentless work on his system. His progress was slow and unsteady, but driven by a rage that seemed to give him strength beyond what his poisoned body should have been able to provide. "You think you're clever," he called out between ragged breaths, "but you don't know everything about this family. You don't know about the others, about what happened to Edmund's first wife, Catherine, about what we did to your precious friend Sarah when she started asking the same questions you've been asking, about the sheriff's daughter who discovered our ledger last year." These revelations struck Margaret like physical blows, each one confirming that the brothers' crimes extended even further than she had imagined. Sarah Caldwell, who had supposedly moved away to care for an elderly aunt in Richmond, had been another victim of the brothers' murderous enterprise. The realization that her friend's disappearance was not voluntary filled Margaret with a rage that overcame her fear and strengthened her resolve to see this through to its conclusion. Clayton appeared in her bedroom doorway, his face pale and covered with sweat, his eyes wild with the knowledge of his approaching death and the desperate need for revenge against the woman who had orchestrated his destruction. He held Edmund's hunting knife in his trembling hand, the blade catching the lamplight with deadly purpose as he struggled to maintain his balance. "If I'm dying tonight," he snarled through gritted teeth, "you're coming with me, you meddling bitch. You think you can poison us like rats and walk away from this? You think you understand what justice means? I'll show you justice, the same justice we showed your friend Sarah when she threatened to expose our business." What followed was a desperate struggle between a poisoned man seeking vengeance and a woman fighting for her life against an opponent whose dying fury gave him strength beyond what his toxin-ravaged body should have possessed. Clayton lunged forward with the knife, but his coordination was severely compromised by the water hemlock coursing through his system, and his attack was clumsy and poorly aimed. Margaret swung the fireplace poker with all her strength, connecting with his wrist and sending the blade spinning across the room with a metallic clatter. Clayton stumbled and fell to his knees, clutching his broken wrist, while the poison continued its relentless work on his nervous system, causing muscle spasms that made it impossible for him to maintain his balance or coordinate his movements. "You killed us all," Clayton gasped, his voice becoming weaker as respiratory failure began to set in. "But you'll never escape." "What?" We built here. The sheriff knows everything. He'll hunt you down." Clayton collapsed to the floor, his body beginning to convulse as the final stages of water hemlock poisoning took hold. Margaret watched with grim satisfaction as the man who had planned her death succumbed to the same fate he had intended for dozens of innocent victims over the course of more than a decade. His threats about Sheriff Garrett only strengthened her resolve to ensure that the full truth about Riverside Manor's crimes would be exposed to authorities beyond Henrico County's corrupted local officials. The house fell silent, except for Margaret's labored breathing and the distant sound of Dr. Henley's final death throes from the library below. Edmund's voice had ceased entirely several minutes earlier, suggesting that the eldest Carmichael brother had already paid the ultimate price for his crimes. The silence that followed was both peaceful and terrifying, as Margaret realized she was now alone with 3 corpses and the enormous task of ensuring that justice would ultimately be served. Margaret spent the remainder of that terrible night alone with 3 corpses and the weight of what she had done, using the time to carefully plan her next moves and ensure that the brothers' crimes would be fully exposed, even if she did not survive the investigation that would inevitably follow. As dawn broke over the tobacco fields of Riverside Manor, she began the grim task of arranging the scene to tell a story that authorities would find credible, while also ensuring that evidence of the brothers' murder enterprise would be discovered. She carefully arranged the scene in the library to support a narrative that investigators would easily accept. 3 men had died from poisoned bourbon, with the implication that Edmund had administered the toxin in a moment of madness before succumbing to it himself. The presence of Dr. Henley as an innocent victim caught up in what appeared to be fraternal murder-suicide would provide the tragedy with the kind of senseless violence that authorities expected from cases involving large sums of money and family disputes. Clayton's body remained in her bedroom, where the struggle had taken place, supporting the story that he had attacked her in his final moments before dying from the same toxin that claimed his brother and their guest. The broken knife and her defensive wounds would corroborate her claim that she had fought for her life against a dying man, seeking revenge for imagined wrongs. But Margaret's most important task was securing the evidence that would expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes and ensure that justice would be served for all their victims. She retrieved Edmund's ledger from its hiding place behind the fireplace brick and gathered all the documentation she had compiled during her investigation. The location of the burial sites, the list of victims, the financial records of their murder enterprise, and her own detailed observations would ensure that the truth about Riverside Manor's dark history would eventually come to light. She also prepared a detailed written account of the events that had led to the brothers' deaths, carefully crafting a narrative that portrayed her as a victim who had discovered her husband's crimes and taken desperate action to protect herself and prevent future murders. The account included specific details about the brothers' methods, their victim selection process, and the locations where evidence could be found to corroborate her story. When the neighbors discovered the bodies 3 days later, alerted by Margaret's apparent state of shock and her claims that she had hidden in the tobacco fields after witnessing the tragedy, the initial investigation proceeded exactly as she had planned. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, despite his previous complicity in covering up the brothers' crimes, found himself forced to conduct a thorough investigation due to the prominent nature of the victims and the shocking nature of their deaths. Margaret played her role as the traumatized widow perfectly, weeping at the appropriate moments and providing just enough detail to satisfy the authorities without revealing her own culpability in the poisoning. She claimed to have heard arguing and shouting from the library, followed by silence that terrified her into fleeing the house and hiding until help arrived. Her story portrayed her as an innocent victim who had narrowly escaped death at the hands of her deranged husband and brother-in-law. The discovery of Dr. Henley's substantial sum of money, apparently untouched in his room, supported the theory that robbery had not been a motive for the deaths. Instead, the evidence suggested a family dispute that had escalated to murder-suicide, with Edmund poisoning all 3 men in a fit of madness before the toxin claimed his own life. But the real vindication came when Margaret anonymously provided Edmund's ledger and her own investigative notes to Sheriff Garrett, claiming she had found them while cleaning out her late husband's effects. The detailed records of the brothers' murder enterprise sent shockwaves through Henrico County and beyond, as the scope of their crimes became apparent to investigators who had previously dismissed numerous missing person reports as unfortunate but unrelated incidents. The excavation of the burial sites marked on Edmund's map revealed 23 bodies in various stages of decomposition, confirming the brothers' decade-long career as serial killers who had preyed on travelers throughout central Virginia. Victims were identified through personal effects, dental records when possible, and missing person reports from across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The Carmichael brothers had operated one of the most successful murder enterprises in American criminal history, claiming lives from 3 states while maintaining their reputation as respectable members of Virginia's society. Among the remains was a woman's body that Margaret insisted on viewing personally, despite Sheriff Garrett's attempts to spare her the ordeal of seeing another victim of her husband's crimes. The corpse, found buried near the creek with a silk wedding dress still clinging to her bones, was identified through jewelry and personal effects as Catherine Phillips Carmichael, Edmund's first wife, who had supposedly died of consumption in 1847. This discovery revealed that Margaret was not the first woman to uncover the brothers' secret, nor the first to be eliminated when she became a threat to their operation. Catherine's murder had been disguised as natural death, with a compliant doctor signing a death certificate citing tuberculosis as the cause. Her burial in the family cemetery had been an elaborate deception, while her real remains had been disposed of like those of the brothers' other victims, hidden among the unmarked graves that dotted the plantation grounds. The investigation into Catherine's death led to the exposure of Dr. Elias Brennan, the physician who had provided false documentation for several of the brothers' crimes in exchange for substantial payments that had allowed him to maintain a lifestyle far beyond what his legitimate practice could support. Dr. Brennan's arrest and subsequent confession revealed the extent of the corruption that had enabled the brothers to operate undetected for more than a decade. The investigation into the Carmichael murders became one of the most notorious criminal cases in Virginia's history, exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government and revealing how wealth and social connections could be used to cover up even the most heinous crimes. Several officials in Henrico County were found to have accepted bribes in exchange for their willingness to overlook suspicious disappearances and deaths connected to Riverside Manor, while others had simply chosen to avoid asking uncomfortable questions that might damage their relationships with the county's most prominent family. Margaret inherited the plantation and its considerable assets, but the property's reputation made it impossible to continue operating as a tobacco farm or to find buyers willing to purchase land that had become synonymous with murder and corruption. She sold the estate to the state of Virginia for a fraction of its value, with the proceeds going to establish a fund for the families of the brothers' victims and to support improved law enforcement training throughout rural Virginia. The manor house was torn down within a year of the investigation's conclusion, its bricks scattered and its location gradually forgotten as the tobacco fields returned to wilderness. Local residents reported that attempts to farm the land failed repeatedly, with crops refusing to grow properly in soil that had been fertilized by the decomposing remains of murder victims. Whether this was due to actual soil contamination or the psychological impact of the land's history on potential farmers, no one could say for certain. Sheriff Thomas Garrett's final report on the case noted that Margaret Carmichael had demonstrated remarkable courage and resourcefulness in exposing crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, claiming additional innocent lives throughout Virginia and beyond. He made no mention of any suspicion regarding her possible involvement in the deaths of her husband and brother-in-law, accepting her story that she had been an innocent victim who survived through luck and quick thinking. The report also commended her decision to provide evidence of the brothers' crimes to authorities, noting that her cooperation had been essential to identifying the victims and providing closure to families who had searched for missing relatives for years without knowing their fate. The fund she established for victims' families was praised as an act of extraordinary generosity that helped heal some of the wounds inflicted by the brothers' reign of terror. Margaret herself disappeared from public view after the investigation concluded, reportedly moving to Baltimore, where she assumed a new identity and began a quiet life far from the scene of her ordeal. Some neighbors claimed to have received letters from her over the years, describing a peaceful existence devoted to charitable work and botanical study. But her ultimate fate remained unknown to the residents of Henrico County, who remembered her courage in exposing the truth about Riverside Manor. The Riverside Manor case became a cautionary tale about the dangers faced by travelers in rural areas, leading to increased law enforcement patrols along major thoroughfares and more careful screening of roadside hospitality throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Innkeepers and plantation owners who offered accommodation to strangers found themselves subject to greater scrutiny from local authorities, while travelers learned to be more cautious about accepting invitations from hosts they did not know personally. But for those who knew the full story, the case served as a reminder that sometimes justice requires taking matters into one's own hands, regardless of the personal cost or social consequences. Margaret Carmichael's actions had not only ended the brothers' murder enterprise, but had also exposed the corruption that had enabled their crimes to continue undetected for more than a decade. The tobacco fields, where 23 victims lay buried, were never farmed again, despite multiple attempts by different owners to cultivate crops on land that should have been fertile and productive. Local residents reported that the soil remained barren and refused to support plant life, as if the earth itself rejected any effort to grow life where so much death had been sown. Whether this was due to soil contamination from the decomposing bodies or some deeper connection between the land and its dark history, no one could say for certain. The case also led to significant reforms in how local authorities investigated missing person reports and suspicious deaths in rural areas. The Virginia legislature passed new laws requiring coordination between county sheriffs when investigating crimes that might cross jurisdictional boundaries, while also establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled the Carmichael brothers to operate with impunity for so many years. What we do know is that Margaret Carmichael demonstrated that even in an age when women had few rights and fewer opportunities for justice, intelligence and determination could triumph over evil when combined with courage and careful planning. Her story shows us that sometimes the most unlikely people can become instruments of justice when the system fails to protect the innocent, and that true courage often means accepting terrible personal risks to prevent even greater tragedies. The final irony of the Riverside Manor case was that the brothers' own obsessive record-keeping, intended to help them manage their murder enterprise more efficiently, ultimately provided the evidence that exposed their crimes and brought justice to their victims. Edmund's meticulous ledger, maintained with the same attention to detail he brought to his legitimate business affairs, became the key that unlocked the truth about more than a decade of systematic murder and revealed the location of graves that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. This mystery shows us how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and social prominence, but also how justice can emerge from the most unlikely sources when good people refuse to accept injustice and are willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret was justified in taking the law into her own hands, or should she have found another way to stop the brothers' crimes? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories of justice served cold. See you in the next video.